Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was an immortal avatar. Immortality is a funny thing, some might think it a gift from the gods themselves. Wouldn't it be wonderful to live forever? To never age? Never die? Would not one call that a blessing? More like a curse. I've died so many times now I've lost count, and yet I keep coming back, with everything intact. Yes, my life is cursed, and yet, I enjoy it. Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard! Chapter 1. Avatar of the Gods. Immortality is a funny thing, some might think it a gift from the gods themselves. Wouldn't it be wonderful to live forever? To never age? Never die? Would not one call that a blessing? Ha! More like a curse. For what else can this be? To watch your friends grow old, while you yourself remain young? Letting them move on with their lives, start families of their own, grow old. To stand there helpless as they wither and die, as you lay those flowers upon each their graves, knowing you were powerless to defeat time itself? The one enemy even I could not hope to defeat. But I digress. I'm sure you're wondering who I am. I have seen and done much in my time, and I'm not necessarily proud of it all. I have helped nations rise and fall. Civilizations have crumbled in less than an hour at my hand. Fought the war to end all wars. Witnessed the end of the shinobi. Traveled to distant lands. I have loved and I have lost, outliving each and every one of my wives and children, helpless to do anything but weep. My tales are many, and my exploits great. I have carved my name into the elemental nations as they were once known 100-fold, and still, I am unsatisfied. I am the last of the dying breed, doomed to reincarnate time and time again until I've fulfilled my purpose. I cannot age, but I can die. If one wishes to know the pain of a spear through their heart, or the painful end of decapitation, you need only ask me. My deaths are many, my lives, seemingly infinite. Now, as this century-old war rages in this land, once again, I feel compelled to act, if not for myself, then for the needs of others. I swear, I'm such a masochist, always throwing myself into the fire for others. What irony! Immortality is indeed a funny and fickle thing, ain't it, folks? Which is how I come to find myself here, in this distant place, in the oddest of situations. My name is Uzumaki Naruto, Avatar of the Gods. And this is my story. Wet. Naruto was not a fan of water in general. Oh, he drank the stuff, of course. Even swam, whenever the whim struck him. But he did not, by any means, enjoy being doused from head to toe. Especially not this early in the morning. Certainly not when he'd elected to accompany two rambunctious children out here in pursuit of fish. It didn't help when one of said children didn't want his help. But their grandmother had been unusually adamant this morning. So here he was, the tribe's last remaining man, babysitting. Honestly, he was getting too old for this. He might be physically trapped at the age of 16, yet that didn't make it any less ridiculous. These people had taken him in, offered him food and shelter. Starvation were one of the worst ways to off himself, not to mention furs when there were virtually none to be found. Perhaps that was why he stayed. He felt he owed these people. And by definition, their children. Including, much to their occasional consternation, as well as his own Sokka and Katara. A moment ago, he'd been laughing when she'd accidentally doused her brother with water in an attempt to catch a fish. Then she had gone and gotten him wet. Now, Naruto was no stranger to the cold, but he was not enjoying the sensation. Not in the least. His sole satisfaction was that he'd managed to catch said fish before it could escape back into the seat. He made for quite a sight, his crystal blue eyes shadowed by sopping wet bangs, his lips quirked downward in a slight frown, gloved mitten clenching tight their hard-earned dinner. Katara. Sorry. Oh, you will be. Naruto grinned and shook himself like a wet dog, spattering her with droplets. Take this. Hey! His grin grew another inch. One good turn deserves another oi. He nimbly dodged aside when she flung a small wave at him in retaliation, thus dousing Sokka even further. The small torrent violently tore the boy's spear from his grasp just before he could successfully skewer his first fish, sending his precious weapon arcing end over end before finally sinking to the water below. Within seconds it was gone, plummeting to the depths and out of sight. A small cry of surprise left his lips. That gobsmacked expression was simply too good to pass up. Both teens burst into laughter. Will the two of you please stop playing your little water games? They're not games, Sokka. Katara admonished. They're. Right, an ancient art indigenous to our tribe. Naruto began to tune their bickering out as the canoe drifted through the ice pack. Southern water tribe or not, the girl had a remarkable amount of spirit. Admirable. She would have made a fine shinobi, back in the elemental nations. The whole bending concept was entirely beyond him, but that didn't mean he was lacking in understanding. These people utilized their chi in the same way he wielded chakra. Bending wasn't all that uncommon, neither was it rare either. He'd been utterly amazed by the sheer ingenuity of some benders when he'd first come here. Perhaps amazed hadn't been quite the right word. Dazzled, perhaps? His first visit since his arrival a century before had been to the Fire Nation. He'd marveled at their destructive art of the Inferno, reminding him so much of the Uchiha with their self-righteous arrogance. Then, the Earth Kingdom with their grand, yet stoic simplicity, and the reclusive yet light-haired air nomads. He'd spent many months creating new jutsu just by witnessing their uncanny manipulation of air currents. Finally, it was to the water tribe which he'd found himself drawn. The war had broken out shortly thereafter. He'd been in the process of evacuating civilians when the Fire Nation killed him. It had taken an entire armada and nearly 1,000 men to do the deed. He'd only been reborn about a handful of years ago in the same place he'd perished. Cold. Naked. Alone. Yup, reincarnation was a bitch and a half. And apparently, he wasn't the only one trapped in this wretched cycle of rebirth. There was this supposed figure. The Avatar. A master of all four elements, meant to preserve peace between the four nations. If so, then where the devil was he? Naruto had never met the man, but anyone doomed to be reborn over and over again had to be one hell of a cynic. He'd only died a handful of times, and each time had been more painful than the last. If the Avatar had gone through the same thing, then he might meet a man. Surely the man hadn't just been hiding out for the last century, had he? No. Of course not. No one was that much of a coward. Not even him. Nevertheless, a certain degree of caution had to be exercised whenever utilizing his own abilities. Couldn't have everyone thinking he was the Avatar now, could he? Even water walking, as he was doing now, drew a fair amount of attention from those not acquainted with it. If he were to bust out his dojutsu or any of the techniques he'd gained from absorbing the Jubi during in the war, he'd probably have half the nation trying to kiss his feet, or worse, if the Fire Nation found out. Not that all of them were bad, there was that Iroh fellow, but regardless, he wasn't exactly eager to be hunted down again. He might not be an avatar of the elements, but he was certainly an avatar of something else. Look out! The blonde jerked his head upwards, drawn from his reverie just in time to witness the inexplicable, for all intents and purposes, appeared to be an iceberg rising from the depths of the ocean in their path. And they were hurtling towards it. A subtle exertion of Shinra Tensei prevented Sokka and Katara from dashing their canoe against the great glacier, but only just. They were still flung from the boat before he could think to stop them, sent sprawling head over heels in a hilarious tumble of arms and legs. You kids okay? Katara mumbled something. Sokka's exclamation was a great deal less reserved. What's that? Naruto eyed it warily, this frozen sphere that stood before them. Was that a kid in there? Unthinking, he chopped down. Hard. Hiya. The icy cage split in twine before the savage chop, releasing a great geyser of steam. And light. Did he mention light? Scarce had his gloved hand touched the eerie orb than a beam of light burst into existence, hurtling upward and into the heavens. A frightening sonic boom shook their surroundings, shattering the fragile canoe, shattering beneath the sudden onslaught of air and sound. Naruto hissed. Not out of fear or awe, or even his own sense of self-preservation, but the knowledge that anyone for miles around would be able to see this. Anyone. Including any Fire Nation vessels. Oh crap. Meanwhile, leagues away, Prince Zuko saw it. And how could he not? Rocketing into the heavens like an arrow loosed from a bow, the great pillar of light dominated his vision, demanding his awe, his attention. His everything. He could feel it calling out to him like a clarion call, the return of his honor merely a few miles to the north. A single thought dominated his mind, turning his scarred face intent with fury. It did not matter to him when it cut off abruptly, he already knew his heading. Knew what did await him there, not just the fight of his life, but the chance to finally, at long last, return home. At long last, I've found him. That which his father, grandfather, and even his great-grandfather had been unable to find. The Avatar. With a brisk stride he stalked past his guards and into the bowels of the ship, dutifully ignoring his uncle when he asked to join him for tea. Zuko did not have time for tea. Not when his destiny awaited. Perhaps had he lingered he might have noticed Iroha's slight smile in passing. Might have heard his words. But as it stood, Zuko did not listen. Instead, he stormed into the cabin and issued a fateful order that would forever reshape his life in ways he had yet to foresee. Unknowing of this, he still gave the order. Helmsman, head for the light. Naruto, what are you doing? Exclaimed Sokka as the blonde extricated his palm from what had, mere moments before, been a sphere of ice. No longer. The second that beam of light had gone up, the former shinobi'd all but attacked the sphere, shredding it to pieces with his bare hands until the light finally dissipated. Now that it had, he'd slowed his assault. Katara could see that his gloves were gone, burned away by the intensities of his strikes, reduced now to little more than rags wrapping his hands. Getting him out. The blonde shook his still-numbed hands in a vain effort to warm them. Ain't that obvious, Era? It looks like we've been beaten to the punch. Both boys turned their attention to the melted glacier, now aware of Katara cradling its occupant. Laying there amidst the ice and snow, his body still glowing ever so slightly, was a boy. But not just any boy. An airbender. The last airbender. Yes, that was the day everything changed. The day we uncovered the Avatar. Chapter 2, Crux. I knew at once that this boy was him. The Avatar. And how could I not? I saw at a glance, the endless power trapped within him. Just as I knew he was, most likely, the last of the airbenders. Many things became clear to me that day, chief amongst them that this avatar of the elements only retained the knowledge of his former lives in his avatar state. He was just a 12-year-old boy, trapped within an iceberg for nearly an entire century. He did not have all the answers, did not hold the knowledge I sought. All these years, for naught. But I knew. This avatar, this boy, would do great things. To this day, I know not how. I simply knew. Nothing escapes these eyes. Why are you staring at me? This from Aang, the boy who, unbeknownst to everyone else, was the Avatar. Naruto stubbornly stifled the urge to reveal that. Aang would so when he was ready. Or so he hoped. He was hesitant to pin his trust on an untested youth, but hadn't he been the same once? To assume Aang was a coward merely for safeguarding his secret would imply that Naruto too was one and the same, unwilling to risk death by exposing himself to the world with his godlike powers and prowess. But he did not hide his powers out of cowardice. It was wisdom that stayed his hand, wielding that much power, letting the world know what you were only made you that much more of a target. Perhaps Aang was of a similar mind. Perhaps not. In a way, they were almost alike. Regardless, it wasn't for Naruto to judge. Oh, nothing. Nevertheless, he allowed a small smile to creep up on his lips. It's just my first time meeting the Avatar. His words were soft, spoken only for the two of them, and yet they still elicited the most startling reaction in the young airbender. For a brief moment, the young boy actually looked afraid. Said fear was just as swiftly replaced by sorrow, the resigned sort that suggested he'd known this was coming all along. Most curious, the Avatar of the gods mused to himself. How did you know? Naruto finished with the slightest of sighs. It wasn't that difficult. I've studied this nation's history. If that flash of power before didn't give you away, then the markings certainly did. Honestly, I'd expected you to be a little taller, though. Older, too. But then again, I guess cryogenically freezing yourself for 100 years is one hell of a way to ease out the wrinkles, no? He allowed his gaze to slip past the baffled boy toward his young wards, observing Sokka and Katara with their tribe. They'll probably figure it out sooner rather than later. So, are you going to tell them, or should I? Aang faltered, momentarily uncertain of what to say. Just who was this strange youth, and why did he seem so familiar somehow? He hadn't said a word on the ride back to the tribe courtesy of Appa, and now suddenly it was as if the blonde could read his very thoughts. What was going on here? There's no rush. Ironically, Naruto felt his heart go out to the boy with these words. You can tell them when you're ready. For all his feigned cheer and supposed legendary status, Aang was little more than that. A child. But there was more to it than being young and untested. Aang reminded him of, himself. He'd been the same way at first, not wanting anything to do with these incredible powers bestowed upon him. In the beginning, he had tried and failed to live a normal life. Looking back, it was rather obvious why he had failed. One simply did not absorb the Jubi into oneself and expect to lead an existence anything short of extraordinary. At first there had been worship, his comrades had respected him, women had practically fallen over another to have his children, and so on. For a terribly long time, he had been reluctant to assume his new role. He didn't want anything to do with these supposed fangirls or their ilk, he only had eyes for a certain Hyuga. Hinata. Her confession had never been far from his mind, but there hadn't been any time to discuss it, what with Akatsuki lurking about and then the war in Madara. By the time everything ended and the Jubi was harmlessly or so he'd thought made one with his soul, nearly a year had passed. More than enough time for him to think on her words. And when things finally settled down, finally able to call her out on it. The rest, well, as they say, is history. Time had flown by so swiftly afterward. Now more than ever he wished he could go back and revisit those first few years, cherish them, before he realized anything was wrong. Before it became apparent that he wasn't changing. Wasn't aging. But he'd been so caught up in their relationship, and then the twins came along and still he'd pushed it off, dismissing it as nothing. Lie after lie became increasingly apparent. He was simply aging well. It was his genes. Yes, that had to be it. Looking back, he'd been far too naive. Reluctant. That reluctance had nearly been the end of him. Everyone saw him as a god in human form at the time, a guardian meant to watch over the shinobi people for all time. Not as the Hokage, but something more. As an avatar. Of the gods. To this day, Naruto wasn't sure who had coined that eerie moniker, but for whatever reason it had stuck. So that was what he became, eventually trading his dream to become Hokage for this newfound role and status. And for a while, things were working out swimmingly. Sasuke had returned to the village as promised, with Sakura now satisfied, and he had a budding family in Hinata. As Hokage, Tsunade was able to help him keep the peace, and awkward as he might be, he'd done a good job of keeping the other nations in line. So, he wasn't aging. Big deal. A mere fly in the ointment. A simple henge kept anyone from realizing the truth, and it wasn't as though he'd been lying to anyone. With his newfound powers, he'd slowly begun to assume his new responsibilities. Peace was flourishing. The people were happy. And then, as suddenly as the peace had begun, everything went to hell. You're not exactly normal yourself. Naruto blinked, unexpectedly drawn from his pained reverie by Aang's words. He was momentarily amused to find the boy peering up at him with, what was the word again? Compassion? Empathy? Whatever the case, Aang's attention was enough to momentarily banish the demons of his long and lengthy past. I'm sorry, did you say something? When next Naruto spoke, it was not the sorrowed shinobi of the elemental nations, but the stoic avatar of the gods. Granted, taking on the role, growing into it over time, learning to respect the need for secrecy, adopting the title even now, it was all just a way of distancing himself from the pain he still felt in the depths of his heart. Whereas Aang's outlook on life was probably a great deal cheerier than his own, in any case. Perhaps he should mirror that same levity? I said, the last airbender continued, you're not so different yourself. Oh? That got Naruto's attention. This boy was more than he appeared. Intrigued, he turned his sapphiric gaze toward the monk-to-be once more. And what makes you say that, Aang? Quashing the pain he felt within his heart, he forced a small smile back to his face and awaited the avatar's answer. Oh, what he wouldn't give for Kurama's voice in his head right about now. It's your eyes. The boy seemed to squirm beneath his gaze. They seem old, somehow. You'd be right. Naruto found himself biting back laughter for the first time since his last death. If I had to guess, I'd say they're 500, give or take a century or two. What? What? It's just a guess. The blonde shrugged. No need to freak out. Time sorta loses its meaning when you've lived as long as I have. Still, freezing yourself, an interesting trick. I think I'll have to try that myself, someday. Well, I wouldn't recommend it. So, you're really an airbender, eh? Naruto asked abruptly. Aang grinned, glad for the change in topic. Sure am. Can you show me? Aang chose that precise moment to sneeze. The subsequent expulsion of air sent him rocketing nearly 10 feet into the air. That little spectacle earned the attention of the entire tribe, not to mention a certain someone, before he descended with grace, landing almost effortlessly upon Appa's back, ending his little air trick with a graceful bow. As if to echo his partner's effort, the sky bison let out a happy snort. Not bad, huh? Impressive. Naruto admitted, clapping as the bender clambered down from his mount. You've got a lot of skill for someone so young. Hey, thanks. But can you do this? Now it was Aang's turn to balk, because scarce had Naruto spoken than the last airbender found himself witness to the inexplicable. Naruto, in the time it had taken to finish that sentence, had levitated his body up off the ground and into the air. He was hovering. Without a glider. He simply hung there, suspended in midair. What's more, he didn't seem to be expending any visible effort at all. But it wasn't as though he were flying in actuality. Aang thought, if he could, then why would he? Wahahaha. Then, as if to shatter that very thought, the former Jinchuriki shed his fur coat and erupted upward, his body little more than a streak of blue and black colors as he tore into the skies. What the heck? Sokka scrubbed at his eyes with both hands, as though the action could somehow wipe away what he was seeing. Is Naruto actually flying? Katara practically squealed in delight at the sight, her earlier reservation forgotten in the wake of this discovery. For indeed the blonde was doing just that, navigating the air using his own chakra to hold/hoist him aloft, wrapping himself in it, and pushing down against the ground simultaneously. It was no means an easy feat, only one with a strong wind affinity could do such a thing, and even then, Naruto himself had spent nearly an entire decade mastering the technique. It was not, as a certain man might have said, a move for beginners. Wow, so you're an airbender, too? I am not a bender. Naruto denied, alighting soundlessly beside Katara. My situation is unique. Like how? Like. He would have said more, had not something brightened the skies over their heads. Blue eyes bulged. Incoming. That was all they heard before a massive ball of fire lit the horizon. Aang barely saw the Fire Nation vessel from whence it came before it engulfed their position. But where had this vessel come from? And how had they found them so swiftly? Too late, there was no longer any time for thought. The projectile ripped into the water tribe and sent everything flying. The villagers were only just able to escape the blast radius thanks to their relative distance of the explosion. Katara wasn't so lucky. The detonation flung her and Sokka away, sending both brother and sister sprawling in the snow. In that instant, Naruto shouted something from up above their heads. Exactly what, the young avatar knew not. Only that the flames abruptly vanished, disintegrating into harmless steam as he looked on. Assholes! Naruto landed in a roaring snarl of fire, spitting curses not meant for the ears of young children. Some of those very words caused Katara to flush, but the sight of him stole any sentiment of laughter away. Black flames rippled off and around his body, and it seemed as though his eyes were bleeding? Impossible to tell. Whatever the case, maybe she had only an instant to recognize any of this before unconsciousness took her before the blonde ushered Aang behind him, just in time for the ramp of the enemy vessel to lower. "Stay behind me," was the last thing she heard. 7 firebenders marched down the ramp in a phalanx, and at their head, a younger man, clearly their leader. "Where are you hiding him?" the prince demanded to know. Scowling, he grabbed hold of Katara's grandmother, shaking her cowl for emphasis. "He'd be about this age, master of all elements? I know he's here." None dared speak. Faced with this refusal, Zuko became incensed. "If you don't reveal him, I'll burn this entire village to the ground." Aang was just about to open his mouth, ready to reveal himself for the sake of these people, when Amaterasu. The blonde muttered that word and the firebenders burned, their plated armor erupting in thick tongues of dark fury as she looked on. Of the 6 guards that had accompanied the prince, only one managed to evade the worst of the blaze besides him, rolling aside and out of harm's way. Naruto simply exhaled and that hapless fool ceased to exist, his body evaporating before a massive fireball all his own. Why a firebender? Why does everyone think that? Naruto groaned, slapping a flaming palm to his forehead. It's not like independent Ohio. He blinked, finally noticing the flames of his chakra creeping around him, the still smoldering bodies around the lot of them. Oops. Forgot about that. Chakra tends to get a little out of whack when I'm pissed off, you know? But I digress. A wave of the hand and the flames abated somewhat, forming a shimmering aura of black and crimson around his form. The noise that followed would be impossible to do justice to using simple onomatopoeic sound effects. It was not quite a VOM, a simple VROM doesn't suffice either, but these are about the closest approximations. For Prince Zuko, the sound equated to one singular emotion. Fear. Aang. Naruto whispered. How many people can Appa carry? About 10. The Avatar found himself replying. It'll have to do. Try to get out of here, I'll buy you some time. What are you whispering about? Like an iron trap, Naruto's gaze locked onto the prince's own. The sheer intensity of his stare, the sudden ice in his expression, was enough to silence the entire tribe. Nothing moved. Nothing at all. And then he spoke, voice black as pitch, eyes cold as the coldest winter, a sharp contrast to the flames boiling around his body. These people are precious to me. The words were little more than a dry hiss. If a knife could talk, this was what it would sound like. Any attack on them is an attack on myself, and I don't take very kindly to being set upon by the likes of Fire Nation thugs like yourself. He pointed one long finger at the proud prince. I suggest you get back on your boat and before you get yourself hurt, boy. Do you have any idea who you're speaking to? Zuko's scarred eye twitched in anger and outrage. I could ask you the same thing. Naruto's grin grew another inch, exposing deadly canine teeth. But since you seem to think I'm a firebender, let's play a little game. He stepped forward, reached out towards the bulk of their vessel, and made a pulping motion with his right hand. If I win, I get to peel your ship like a banana and set you adrift for a few days. You win, and I'll give you the avatar. Tell me, my dear prince, are you at all familiar with the term, Agnikai? What, what? Zuko spluttered. How dare you suggest such a thing, you traitor? Naruto snockered. It seems I've struck an old wound. Wouldn't have anything to do with that mark now, would? Zuko let loose an emotionally toiled scream and lunged, fists ablaze. I'll kill you. Go, Aang. Naruto roared, a heartbeat before the prince pounced upon him. And then he no longer had any time to worry about anyone other than himself. Fighting at full strength was one thing, but to actively restrain himself from using his full potential against such a lesser opponent soon proved far more difficult, or not. Naruto laughed as Zuko's fist swung harmlessly over his head. Too wide. Not narrow enough. The blast of fire that came with the strike was batted aside so effortlessly it may as well not have existed at all. Was this what amounted to taijutsu these days? Pitiful. Absurd. He clapped his hands and flung them outward. That easy, effortless gust of wind chakra was all it took to keep the boy off balance and summarily off his back. He simply couldn't make any progress against the headwind. Ha! Ha! He scolded. What's wrong, Zuko? Your great-grandfather was better than this. The prince snarled, utterly unaware of the bison rising behind him. Fight me like a man, Avatar. Naruto scoffed and spat a small fireball. Look, the blonde drawled as he battled the boy backwards, how many times do I have to tell you, I'm not the Avatar? His words ended in a resounding whoosh as he summoned forth a great geyser of water from deep within his stomach, spewing the violent wave forward, extinguishing the fiery blast and bowling the prince head over heels. But the young firebender simply would not go down. Scarce had he fallen than he was up again, flinging himself at the former Jinchuriki in furious fashion. Stop lying. He snarled between blows, only the Avatar could manipulate the elements like that. Naruto's deadpan was barely concealed. Oh, for the love of, fine. You want me to fight like a firebender? Naruto shrugged, and it suddenly seemed that a great weight had been lifted from him, a tremendous effort he no longer had to sustain. Then I'll fight like a firebender. With a laugh he thundered forward, nearly clotheslining the poor prince. What did you do? Zuko hissed, panic edging into his voice as he skittered backwards. Naruto's gleeful expression certainly didn't help any. I decided to fight you seriously. Appa. Aang's voice seemed to come from a great distance. Yip. Katara managed to open her eyes, but the world wouldn't stay still and stop shaking. The ringing in her ears wouldn't stop either. Sitting up was not as hard as she expected, but a loud rustling broke through the ringing of her Rar's piles of snow settle shifted, thrown off not by her meager arms, but by the blazing heat of the atmosphere itself, the most casual application of the combatant's strength. She could feel the rest of their tribe stirring nervously around her. Small as it was, they all fight on Appa's back, the easier to be fielded to safety. As she stepped slowly back into the land of consciousness, she gradually became aware of a rhythmic crashing noise, the footfalls of a sprinting giant. Her chi sense was the last to return, and with that to aid her, she was finally able to pinpoint the sources of the noise only a few yards below. Prince Zuko was still furiously attacking Naruto, relentlessly hammering down blows on the blonde's guard, which stubbornly held. That in and of itself, the fusion of her friend's refined martial arts skill, the product of decades of dedicated training, and his own monstrous natural power, gave him an unbelievably quick, fluid and adaptable defense, and when he moved on to the attack, each strike was carefully calculated for maximum effect, almost impossible to follow, and devastating when it landed. It was like watching a river flow, not a single movement was wasted. And Zuko was overwhelmed. The younger boy didn't stand a chance. When he tried to retreat, the blonde cut him off. When he sought to strike and attack, Naruto simply absorbed all his blows, and while the occasional fist would slip through, he didn't seem too much care for the burns. Always Naruto was there, pressing, pressing the offensive with a single-minded ferocity bordering on downright primal instinct. Abruptly as their bout began, it was over. Zuko toppled backwards from a fireball to the chest, his armor shattering, stomach now badly burned. Naruto bounded after him, swiped him off his feet with a single hand, ready to deal the final blow. Zuko gazed back at him, golden eyes defiant, ready to accept whatever fate might be his. Finish it, Avatar. Before Katara could think to say anything, lest she try to stop him, the blonde struck down. Hard. Not with his fist, but with his head, the final blow not dealing death, yet rendering the prince insensate all the same. He rose stiffly after that, Naruto did, extracting what looked like a small brush and ink from his coat pocket. He promptly set to work on Zuko's face seconds thereafter, his fine brush strokes growing maddened and erratic as he hastened to complete his work before the proud prince stirred. Whatever he was writing, Katara couldn't see it, but it seemed to be sending Sokka into a fit of hysterical laughter. Then, incredibly, Naruto spoke. Not to Zuko, but to the ship itself. Or perhaps he spoke to the portly figure sitting upon its bow? Iroh. He shouted. I'll let your nephew live, this time. Tell him he needs to be stronger to face me. Speaking of which, you may want to hang on. With that, he pointed hand toward the ship. Then, he did something inexplicable. In the blink of an eye, without any discernible motion on his part, he destroyed the vessel's engines, warped its hull, and bodily wrenched the ice cutter onto land with a not-so-subtle application of Shinra Tensei. Another leap sent the blonde soaring into the air, and onto Appa's saddle. When asked if he was all right, the whiskered warrior merely grunted. I've had enough excitement for one day. Chapter 3, Kyoshi. At first, I couldn't believe it. Even now, the thought still leaves me reeling, sometimes. All the airbenders. Gone. Eli mated. Put the sword. Burned at the torch. You get the picture. At Aang's behest we'd gone to visit the Southern Air Temple, expecting to find, what, exactly? I didn't much seem the point at the time, but who was I to deny his request? We'd already escaped from the Fire Nation, drawing them away from Katara's family and tribe at the risk of our own skins. Somehow along the way, Katara developed a desire to travel to the North Pole and master waterbending alongside Aang. And of course, Sokka decided to come as well. I was just along for the ride. Who was I to say where they could and could not go? In Aang's shoes, wouldn't I do the same? Would I not jump at the chance to see if all my old friends were still alive? So away we went, their expectations high. Mine remained low. What we found there was only ruin. Old bones, battered armor, shredded garments and shattered skulls. Aang nearly lost himself. And who could blame him? My own rage for the Fire Nation grew tenfold that day. But what could I do? Even I can't bring back someone who's been dead for more than a century. I'd just be breathing life back into Gyatso's bones. Without his flesh and organs, he wouldn't last more than a few seconds at the most, and that's being generous. It broke my heart to tell Aang this, that despite all my power, the monks were simply too far gone. I'll never forget that look of heartbreak on his face. Some avatar of the gods I am. Still, my heart goes out to these kids. Katara said that we're Aang's family now. Oddly enough, I find myself agreeing with her. And by the gods, if anyone tries to lay a hand on my family, I will break them. A simple task, considering we only had Zuzu to worry about at the time. Fee. That little flame was no threat to myself or Aang. Truly, I had no fears when we arrived on the Isle of Kyoshi. Indeed, one could even say I had become complacent. It never once occurred to me that someone else might join in the hunt for us. Su. Naruto stubbornly resisted the urge to open his eyes, refusing to turn his head and peer over his shoulder as Aang popped up behind him. Thank the god Zappa could fly himself. Instead of giving in to his own curiosity, he forced his mind to focus on the task at hand. Not now, Aang. He chided. I'm trying to concentrate. He was sitting in a meditative position and concentrating on his outstretched right hand. After a few seconds, what looked like blue chi to Aang began to swirl around his palm. It began to compress in upon itself as more and more began form and swirl. Soon enough, floating a few inches above his palm was a blue spinning orb. He saw Naruto's eyes focus on the orb and it began to spin even faster and form 4 white blades spinning with the orb. As he watched the orb spin, the last airbender could have sworn he heard a low thrumming, like something was trying to cut the air itself. What in the world is that? The orb continued to spin, growing larger and larger, encompassing his entire palm until Naruto let out a sigh and relaxed, letting the orb disappear. Good, he said to himself. I've still got it. It was then that he became aware of everyone's attention. Katara had paused in stitching Sokka's pants to gawp at him, her mouth forming a small, round O of disbelief. Sokka looked as though he'd been preparing another one of his infamous jokes, but the sight of the mini raisin shuriken seemed to have stolen those words away. Finally, he looked at Aang, apparently confused by the boy's bowed head and lack of reaction. Is something the matter? That was so cool. The sheer force of Boy's exultation nearly knocked the shinobi off the bison. Thankfully he managed to right himself and levitate at the last instant. In matter of moments, he rejoined them, alighting effortlessly upon the saddle once more, though looking no less pleased for the effort. Oi! He cried. Are you trying to knock me off Appa or something? You've got to show me how to do that. Aang would not be dissuaded so easily. Naruto's expression turned somber. I can't. He replied. And even if I could, I still wouldn't teach you. Aw, but why not? This attack is meant to be used as a last resort and nothing more. The blonde countered, eyes hidden beneath his roughened bangs. If I were to unleash it on someone, say a firebender for example, it would damage them so badly they'd never be able to bend again. That is a fate I would wish on no man or woman, no matter how vile. He cracked an uneasy grin, then, a vain attempt to lighten the mood. Hey, why the long faces, guys? I may be a monster, but at least I'm on your side, you know? A somber silence followed those words, broken only by the wind in their hair or Aang's lack thereof and the passing of the clouds over and under their heads. Finally, someone decided to break it. You're not a monster, Naruto. Naruto looked up, startled to find Katara's hand on his own. Look, Katara, I appreciate the sentiment, but let's be honest here. I killed those firebenders back there, only sparing the prince on a whim. Hell, I enjoyed the killing. Do you hear me? It felt good. If that doesn't make me a monster, then I don't know what. You are not, she repeated firmly, a monster. What's wrong with you? Naruto's lips parted in reply, but her other hand clamped over his mouth before he could speak. Why would you even think such a thing after all you've said and done for us? Why, Aang is still alive, because of you. Our tribe wasn't destroyed by the Fire Nation because of you. Sokka and I are still standing here. Because of you. If protecting those you care for makes you a monster, then I'm one too. Something in those teary blue eyes of hers struck and forestalled him, preventing any argument on his part from pressing the issue any further. With that, Naruto relented. All right. He sighed, pushing a hand across her head. By the gods, girl, don't start bawling on me now. Are you two done fighting? Katara promptly flushed, pulled away, and went back to sewing Sokka's pants. We weren't fighting, Aang. Yeah, Sokka sighed good-naturedly. Stop bugging her, airhead. You need to give girls space when they do their sewing. What does me being a girl have to do with sewing? There was a dangerous glint in Katara's eye now, an accusatory tone that, for those who knew her, would cause them to duck for cover. Sokka made the foolish and nearly fatal mistake of pressing the issue. Simple. He replied, uncrossing his arms behind his head. Girls are better at fixing pants than guys. And guys are better at hunting and fighting and stuff like that. It's just the natural order of things. Naruto and Aang simultaneously facepalmed. They recognized the verbal gaffe, but did Sokka? Nope. The young warrior of the water tribe realized his mistake far too late. All done with your pants. His sister held up the half-stitched article of clothing and flung it in his face. And look what a great job I did. Wait. I was just kidding. I can't wear these. Katara, please. Relax, Sokka, where we're going you won't need any pants. We're here. Elephant koi? Naruto watched with bemusement as his fellow avatar rode the giant fish. It wasn't until something started to eat those massive koi that he began to worry. What if something happened to him? He wasn't exactly keen on saving the world by himself, and if Aang died he wouldn't reincarnate for quite some time. Not to mention he'd be reborn in the water tribe and any chance of him learning airbending would go out the window. A small chuckle fled his lips, unbidden, as Aang sped away from the gigantic creature, running across the water's surface through sheer speed alone before slamming into Sokka seconds thereafter. In the end, his efforts weren't even needed after all. What was that thing? Katara wondered. I don't know. Naruto already knew. Probably an unagi. He stepped back toward the shallows whilst Katara went to check on Aang and her now considerably battered brother. They're native to these parts, after all. Well, unagi or not, I'd rather not stick around. Sokka decided, dusting himself off. Time to hit the rule. What the heck? Everything happened so swiftly. One moment they were standing beneath the trees, listening to Sokka. The next, 4 shadows leapt from the branches and attacked them. In the time that it took Naruto to turn his head, Sokka, Katara, even Aang and Momo, were all subdued, bound and blindfolded, thrown down to the sands at his feet. Naruto was spared only because he'd been standing near the beach. It gave him just enough time to realize their attackers weren't men as he'd first suspected, but women. No, not even that. Girls. Oh, Sokka is gonna be so pissed when he wakes up. Then the girls turned around to face Naruto. It was impossible to distinguish one from the other, he realized, what with the white makeup that covered their faces entirely, those red and black accents around their eyes lending their visages an almost regal appearance beyond the metal headdress and armored battle dress they wore. These strange female warriors looked at him for a long instant, before turning to face him as one, the combined movement causing their armored dresses to rustle, ever so slightly. It was alluring in a way. To say anything less would belittle their strength. Despite himself, the blonde felt the beginnings of a small smile work its way across his whiskered visage. I don't suppose we could sit down and talk about this over a cup of tea? Suddenly, and without warning, one of them attacked. Naive. Naruto simply swung his hand forward and punched with 1/5 of his full strength, the sheer shockwave of the strike summoning forth a great gust, ripping her from her feet and hurtling her across the beach. He'd sked softly as she skidded across the sands in a tangle of arms and legs. He'd forgotten just how fragile the people of this land could be. Can't we just discuss this like civilized folk? He addressed the remaining three, hoping to refrain from further violence. It was not to be. They struck up their fans and moved to encircle him, but slowly, this time wary of this sudden and unseen burst of power. Their painted faces betrayed very little, perhaps the slightest twinge of concern for their injured kin, but nothing more. Look, this is pointless. Naruto continued. You're just going to end up on the ground like her. When the fate of their ally did not dissuade the remaining 3 warriors, the avatar of the gods took it upon himself to strike respect into their proud hearts. Not with close combat, of course, even he might find himself at a bit of a disadvantage when holding back and facing 3 warriors like this in their native land. So, the knuckle-headed ninja did what came best to him. He improvised. For flicks of his fingers summoned forth a massive dragon of water, its golden eyes narrow and intent as it took stock of the 4 girls, their fallen comrade having only just reclaimed her footing. Interesting. So, these girls were capable of withstanding him at a feeble 1/5 of his strength? One of the warriors saw fit to give voice to her awe. What in the world? Suiryu no Jutsu. Water Dragon Jutsu. Naruto exhaled softly and abruptly loosed the tentative leash he'd kept upon his jutsu. With a roar that would have put the Yanagi to shame, it lunged forwards. Two of the girls weren't swift enough to evade its watery maw. They found themselves swept away by the roaring tide as the beast impacted upon the beach. Their bodies were wrenched angrily against the trees, twisted to join the prone forms of his three friends, coughing and sputtering as the wall of water receded. 2 down. 2 to go. Resigning himself to battle, the blonde beckoned the remaining huntresses forward. Come on, girls. Let's get this over with. The pair exchanged a hesitant/tentative glance. Clearly, they weren't accustomed to fighting someone who could actually fight back, certainly not someone of his caliber. But they had their duty, and he had his. As one they pounced, their fans little more than a golden blur. He toyed with them for that brief instant, not too shabby, amazed when one actually managed to scratch him with her fan, before a solid punch broke through his guard. Poof! Both girls balked as their opponent exploded into smoke, leaving a harmless log in his wake. What manner of sorcery was this? Where was he? Where had he gone? Suki, where did he? I don't know, Q beneath you. Her words ended in a frightened cry as a pair of hands burst through the sand, latching onto her friend's ankles. Before either of them could hope to react, their owner yanked down. Hard. Q lost a startled cry, her eyes scrunching shut as she prepared to be buried, up to her neck. Those same eyes flew open, startled to find that while she had indeed been buried beneath the sands, it was only to her neck. It was a rather surreal experience, being unable to move anything above her neck, forced to look up at her leader. Q. I'm alright, the girl tried to shrug, but failed, I think. 3 down. Of course, she's alright. A familiar voice chided. Contrary to popular belief, I'm not trying to harm you. Her companion whirled around as Naruto emerged from the earth beside them, covered in sand. Without so much as a glance in Suki's direction, he began to stride back toward his bound friends. He didn't have even a scratch on him. If anything, he looked amused by their efforts. Wait. Naruto stopped in his tracks, his face slowly appearing over his shoulder as he curiously regarded his once fallen opponent. A look of irritation crossed his single eye as it regarded the recovering warrior behind him, her painted face narrow in a rictus of confusion. Did you want something? What did you do to her? She demanded to know. Naruto laughed and looked away again. Earth style. He admonished with a waggling finger. Headhunter Jutsu. She won't be moving for a while. He gave an amused grunt as Suki seized him from behind, her arms wrapping around his shoulders in a full Nelson and with surprising strength for someone of her size, wrenching him up off his feet. You got me. He laughed as he fell, toppling backwards to the sands. Clever, girl. But. With a hiss, he opened his mouth and spat, expelling a vicious stream of fire in the same instant that his face would have hit the sands. A flash of recognition flickered through Suki's mind just then. He'd used air to send one of her friends flying, water to take down 2 more, earth to immobilize Q, and now, fire? Could he really be? But that's impossible. Not for me, it isn't. Naruto never let up in his barrage, not once. Each blast pushed him another inch up into the air and caused the temperature to spike. This sudden expulsion of heat forced the Kyoshi warrior to loosen her hold upon the shinobi or be burned, allowing him to wrench himself free and let loose a bone-jarring strike of his own design. Suki lost all semblance of breath as an armored shin crunched into her equally armored stomach and the later yielded. The blow wasn't crippling, but it did send her staggering away and give him time to rise. Time he gladly took. Naruto stood amidst the now glassy sand, his body still shimmering with heat, his hair rippling in the steam created by his last attack. His entire body seemed to ripple with barely suppressed energy. It was like gazing into the sun's light overlong, stare at it, and you'd only be burned. Enough! He declared. You fought well, but that last blow's gonna to one hell of a bruise. I know you're hurting right now, and I'd rather you not exacerbate the injury. Honestly, the girl expected her to fling herself at him in spite of her injuries and begin her offense anew. Imagine his surprise when Suki threw down her fans and fell to a knee. I knew it, she gasped, clutching at her side. You're the Avatar. Crap. He'd been too focused again. Me? Why me? He asked with surprise. I'm nothing special. Don't lie. Anger sharpened her tone. You used fire, earth, water, and air. No other bender can do that. I suppose you wouldn't listen to me if I told you I wasn't a bender. Sincerity warmed her expression somewhat, so too did her misunderstanding. Look, you don't have to be shy about it. I can understand if you'd want to keep it a secret. But You don't, I'm not. Naruto groaned. Oh, for the love of, help me out here, Aang. MMMPH. The boy's words were muffled around his gag. Naruto's sweat dropped. The situation was rapidly unraveling. If this continued, if Suki told the others in her village, everyone would think he was the Avatar. A horrible realization dawned on him, one he never wanted to experience again, not if he could avoid it. Can I have a minute to untie my friends? Suki nodded. Naruto swiftly did just that, unbidding Katara and the others in the blink of an eye. Strategy meeting. He hissed. Now. What's wrong, Naruto? Katara asked. They think I'm the Avatar, that's what. Sokka adopted a thoughtful expression. And that's a problem? Naruto glared bloody red daggers at him. Look, I've got an idea. I object. Sokka frowned. You haven't even heard it yet, Naruto. Oi, I know you. And I know this is a bad idea. Look, Naruto might not be a bender, but at this rate, everyone will think he is. Right? At everyone's nod, he pressed forward. Well, I say, let them. Naruto immediately opened his mouth to veto that, but Sokka kept at it before the blonde or Aang could get a word in edgewise. Now wait just a minute, both of you. Hear me out. Right now, who is Prince Hothead hunting, Aang? You, or Naruto? Who does he think is the Avatar? Katara tilted her head, she hadn't considered that question until this very moment. Aang? Do you know the answer? Naruto. The young Avatar was beginning to see where this plan was going, and he didn't like it. Not one bit. Naruto was of the same mind. It felt like he was stealing the poor boy's thunder. That just wasn't his style, nor did he enjoy wresting the claim to fame away from another. For Sokka to ask such a thing of him No. He couldn't do it. It wasn't just his humility, he'd worked so hard to keep the Fire Nation from pestering him after his last death, and while he was already living a life on the run, he wasn't exactly keen on advertising his powers. I can't believe I'm saying this, Boo. Sokka has a point. Katara. You too? It would give Aang all the time in the world to focus on his bending. The waterbender persisted. Besides, I've seen how much skill you have with the elements. Even though you're not a bender, you could still pass for the Avatar easily. Why are you fighting us on this? Because I don't want to do it. Naruto argued. And you're forgetting about Aang. How does he feel about all this? 3 pairs of eyes focused upon the last airbender. Well, Aang, what do you think? Sokka and Katara asked almost simultaneously. Naruto shook his head rapidly, a silent plea for him to say no. Poor boy, he actually flinched. Does it really matter? Think of it this way. Sokka pointed out, we know for a fact that Naruto can handle almost anything the Fire Nation throws at him. We all know you're strong, Aang, but if something happened to you, well, I don't know what we'd do. The Avatar might be reborn, but there's only one you. Now that we have Naruto, we actually have an option. And while he is the avatar, just think how much free time you'd have. It'd be even easier to master the elements. The avatar seemed to consider this. Naruto growled, deep and low in his throat. Horrible idea. Terrible idea. I think it's a winner. Sokka reaffirmed. Says the boy who was beaten by a girl. Naruto hissed. That was a fluke. Right. Hey, do you want to save the world or not? That's low. Aang groaned. You guys, I have a bad feeling about this, but if it helps with my training, let's do it. Sokka turned to his sister. I would like to state for the record that those words did not come out of my mouth. Naruto was still muttering to himself when he stalked back to Suki. Every fiber of his being railed against this, but he could see the need for it. As much as he might loathe it, sometimes choices like this had to be made, regardless of whether he liked them or not. With this in mind, he steeled himself to speak. What was all that about? She asked. Just a discussion of how long we intend to stay. The blonde lied. Still, you'd best gather your elders. I have a message for them. And what might that be? A delicate brow quirked in questioning. Tell them that the avatar has returned. The word traveled like wildfire. The avatar had returned. And he was upon Kyoshi. One would think it ironic that hearsay could move so swiftly, but it did. Word of mouth passing from a young girl to that of a fisherman on the docks of Kyoshi, from said fisherman to that of an Earth Kingdom trader, work, then a Fire Nation cook, until at long last, those words reached the ears of a certain prince. For a moment, said firebender could barely believe his luck. Here he had sat down to dinner, resolved to another sleepless night. What? Zuko lurched up from the dinner table, the steaming salmon on his plate now forgotten. The avatar is on Kyoshi Island? Foolish words, spoken in anger and haste. Helmsman, change course at once. Unbeknownst to him, another became aware of that location as well. 1 week later, Naruto grunted as he parried his opponent's blow, using the same leverage against her to negate the force of her throw. She struggled back, trying to use his own strength against him, but his stance proved simply too solid for her to breach. Likewise, she proved too fluid to grasp without serious effort on his part, effort he wasn't willing to expend just yet. They stood there, a long moment, staring one another down, refusing to yield to give ground, to back down, to yield. Finally, at an unseen command, they broke apart. Your stance is getting better, the ex-shinobi found himself commending. Soki. I wish you'd stop holding back. She sighed, straightening and closing her fan. Hey, if I did that, it wouldn't be any fun. Was it just his imagination, or was that a flush beneath the face paint? He stood in a radically altered version of the Kyoshi battle dress, contoured to fit his male physique. Minus the white face paint, of course. Tradition or not, he simply refused to go through that again. It had been hilarious to see Sokka wearing it yesterday. The poor boy didn't have any skill with the needle, and as such, had been forced to wear something similar to what his sparring partner wore. Before an unseen. Naruto, my Lord Avatar. Naruto looked up from his sparring session with Suki, momentarily discomfited by that title. Sokka's plan was working well, everyone thought he was the Avatar. Not Aang. It made sense from a certain point. While he drew attention, the young airbender could learn all the bending he required without the undue attention of being hunted by the Fire Nation. That didn't mean he had to like it though. Far from it, he loathed this idea. The idea of taking credit for someone else had never sat well with him. Having actual power had done little to temper that distaste. Nearly a full week had passed since their arrival in Kyushu. Ironically, he had been the one to argue for their extended stay. He didn't know if it was Suki, or the something else, he simply felt drawn here. But what was it? Suki was a nice girl after all, he supposed. She'd warmed to him considerably during the last 7 days, and although he remained loath to admit it, he did enjoy their spars, especially Stop. Stop. That way lay ruin. Shaking himself from those treacherous thoughts, Naruto rose, wiped the sweat from his brow, and turned to face the messenger standing in the door. Yes, what is it? Fire Nation troops have landed in Kyoshi. The blonde nearly face-bombed at the news. So much for this peace and quiet. Not Zuko again. Zuko? Suki asked as he slipped his armor on. He's just some pesky prince I beat in the South Pole. Naruto replied, donning his jacket. Don't worry about it. In the meantime, I need you to get Aang and the others. We may need to bug out if things get heated in any case. But, Suki, I won't endanger your island any longer than I already have. A small pang twisted at his heart as he said this. In the lone week that they'd spent here, he'd actually felt normal. To leave that behind and voyage out into the unknown again was strangely disheartening. It was selfish of me to make everyone stay here this long. I've put you all in danger because of that. What? You don't think I can handle a few Fire Nation troops? She challenged as he slipped on the last of his armor. No, I understand that you're a warrior, but firebenders are way out of your league. So, you just don't trust me, then? A pained note entered her tone, her painted face seemed strangely sad somehow. Damn it, warrior girl, why won't you listen? Her hand closed around his wrist, holding him fast. Yes, I'm a warrior. She replied, her voice the barest whisper. Something soft touched his whiskered visage an instant later. But I'm also a girl. Naruto blinked, touching a hand to his cheek. Opened his mouth to speak, but it was already too late. Suki, she was gone, leaving him with his innermost thoughts. Where the hell had that come from? Strange creatures, women. Truly. He crossed the streets with swift strides, reaching the docks almost in no time at all. Oddly enough, he didn't encounter any firebenders. That was odd in and of itself. The closer he came to the docks, the more certain he became, they were waiting for him there. The barge didn't even lower its ramp until he was a few feet away. Nevertheless, he prepared himself for battle. All right, Prince Hothead, he growled, flexing his fingers, are you ready for round 2? I'd call it round 1. The hell dash? Naruto was expecting Zuko to step off that ship and face him. Not a girl. Certainly not someone his age. Sheesh, first Suki and those Kyoshi warriors, and now this? Why did he seem to be facing the opposite sex as of late? Was fate messing with him or something? It must be. So, he stood there and watched wary as this newcomer surveyed her surroundings. There was something dangerous about her. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, perhaps it was her aura? Or maybe it was the eyes. In any case, Uzumaki Naruto, avatar of the gods, found himself just a touch uncomfortable. So, this is Kyoshi Island. The girl murmured to herself as she disembarked. It seems father was right to plant that spy on Zuzu's ship after all. And now I've beaten him to the punch. How wonderful. She extended her slim shoulder in a shrug. Honestly, what more could a girl ask for? Suddenly wary, Naruto edged a foot forward. This girl wasn't like the others he'd fought. You're not Zuko. The girl saw him and smiled then, it was a soft, deadly, dangerous thing, that smile. Well, what do we have here? She chuckled. You mean to say you're the avatar that I've heard so much about? Her gaze roamed across his lightly armored body with intrigue, a spark of interest shining in those dark orbs of hers. You certainly are handsome, I'll give you that. But you should be humbled. A hand rose in a fierce flourish of blue flame. You have the honor of addressing Azula, Princess of the Fire Nation. I do hope you've prepared yourself. For? Why, for the fight of your life, of course. Azula said it as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. You didn't think I rushed here ahead of my brother just to have tea now, did you? Despite himself and all his power, Naruto actually blanched behind his guard. Ah, Christ. Then his vision swelled with azure fire. Chapter 4, Burn It Down. How do I get myself into these situations? Pretending to be the Avatar was bad enough. Fooling an island, then the entire world, was bad enough. But to have the princess of the Fire Nation gunning for me straight out of the gate? That was too much. I'd never once asked for this responsibility, but now, I'd taken on even more. Now, all of Kyoshi knew who I was. And they were depending on me. Not Aang. Me. A fake. A phony. I was an avatar, but not the one they needed, certainly not the one they wanted at any rate. That realization still rankles me to this very day. But I was all they had at the time. And who could do it, if not me? And who was I to let them down? So, I did what I did best, I kicked asses and took names. Little did I know the consequences of that battle would change everything. What's wrong, Avatar? Azula laughed arrogantly as the blonde backpedaled steadily in retreat. Afraid of fire? You should be. Now hold still. And let you burn me? I think not, Fire Girl. Naruto stubbornly resisted the urge to give in to his own anger and attack, refused to play to his enemy's strategy. Instead, he continued to bob and weave, leading the proud princess on a winding path further and further away from the village. Avatar or not, he wasn't willing to risk innocence just for the sake of his own glory. But this was swiftly becoming tedious. He'd thought to lead Azula and her troops away from the village. In that at least, he'd been partially successful. Azula had chased after him like a moth to flame, leaving her troops to remain behind. Even now he could see the fires beginning to burn in Kyoshi, tongues of ember creeping through those thatch roofs, their rosy hues mingling with that of the setting sun. He silently prayed Suki had made it to Aang and the others in time, that they'd be able to handle themselves. Of course, they would. They had Suki and the Kyoshi warriors backing them up after all, and it wasn't as though they couldn't handle a few firebenders, he hoped. But that left him dealing with the princess. Alone. He was swiftly beginning to regret that decision. Azula wasn't a damn thing like her brother. These strikes of hers were precise and perfect, hardly a flaw to be seen amidst them. And that was without the firebending. Those grand sweeps of fire, those azure flames, were proving a great deal warmer than he would have liked. A mere trifle to deal with at full strength, but if he were to do that here, he'd wreck the entire island. Perhaps even destroy it altogether. Still, they came closer and closer, those blows did, with each instant he tarried, singing hairs and leaving burns, albeit small ones, upon his face. Injuries he was certain would take days to heal. Days, instead of seconds. It was one of the few perks he'd forfeited by absorbing the Jubi. For all the incredibly power he'd gained, all the awesome abilities of Sharingan, Rinnegan, and mastery over all the elements of shinobi, there had been one mortal drawback, one flaw to all the perfection he'd gained. Naruto couldn't regenerate. At the very least, not instantaneously as he once had. Not anymore. In the beginning, he'd healed relatively swiftly, but, with each passing death, his healing had grown slower and slower. Now, he felt every near miss, every burn that seared itself into his visage. And he endured. Never once did he strike back, ever retreating, always on the defense until he was certain, absolutely certain, that he'd escaped the blast zone, given Kyoshi village and an acceptable radius of distance. Finally, enough was enough. New KKs. His hand shot forth to meet Azula's, the first direct confrontation since she'd tried to attack him back in the village. Flame met a headwind and the former yielded, snuffed out like a candle in the wind, do excuse the pun, a heartbeat later. All that remained was the faintest wisp of steam curling outward from her first. The princess frowned, but quickly regained her confidence when the blonde drew back and adopted a familiar stance. He was going to fight firebending with firebending, then? Interesting. And were those black flames forming around his fists? Truly this young man continued to astound by Agni. When he moved, she barely saw him. One moment he was standing across from her, arms raised. The next his fist slammed into her cheek, sending her neck, followed by the rest of her body, snapping to the side. The sheer force of that single punch launched Azula halfway across the plane. With a surprised grunt, the light-skinned princess went flying down the training ground, a trail of dark blood following her body through the falling debris. Naruto breath caught in his throat, hitching as he struggled and failed to suppress a laugh. He watched as Azula's limp body slammed against the stones once gravity took hold of her, her skin skidding across the ground as the momentum continued to drag her over the earth. Her feet were suddenly free from the ground as a burst of fire from palms carried her over the sun-soaked terrain, stopping her just short of smashing into a nearby boulder. Just as Naruto had suspected, a roundhouse blow in his restrained form that would have floored someone like Zuko had only left the girl slightly out of breath, dizzy perhaps, but still very much in the fight. Not to mention pissed. By the gods, I really need to stop holding back against these firebenders, they're just too tenacious. So, you finally decided to fight back? Azula didn't even bother to keep the smile from her face as she picked herself up. It's about time. Naruto risked a glance for his surroundings. Kiyoshi could be seen on the shoreline, only a few miles away now. It would have to do. Something like that, yes. He replied, quietly cursing himself for not finishing the little hellcat when he had the chance. We've retreated to an acceptable distance, in any case. Oh? A delicate brow arched in benign amusement. And here I thought you were running away, but you were trying to save the village, weren't you? How quaint. She chuckled, then, it sounded oddly girlish emerging from the mouth of a hardened killer such as herself. Well played, Avatar. Her congratulations dripped with derision. Well played indeed. But it doesn't matter, not really. My men are the best of the best. If those peace-loving Kyoshi warriors refuse to see reason and surrender, they'll simply burn your precious village to the ground. Of course, if you surrender yourself, I could always convince them to put the fires out. Is that so? It is. The blonde's smugness infuriated her, but Azula refused to let it show. So what do you say, Avatar? If you come quietly, I might be able to put in a good word for you with Fire Lord Ozai. Oh, isn't that kind of you? Naruto's words dripped with false sweetness. And to what do I owe this kindness? To his surprise, Azula actually flushed. Is it so wrong for me to be kind to a potential captive? On so many levels. Naruto's deadpan was barely concealed. Well, in that case, I hope you enjoy watching your precious village burn. Actually, you might want to take another look. The blonde raised a long finger and pointed. I don't think your boys will be burning anything anytime soon. Against her better judgment, Azula did just that. What she saw there astounded her. There, rising in the distance, was some sort of sea serpent. There could be no other word for the giant Unagi. And then, to her dismay, it actually spewed water from its open maw, dousing the burning village within the blink of an eye. Its duty done, and the flames extinguished, the Unagi tossed back its head and loosed a final triumphant cry before disappearing back into the ocean's depths. Had one gazed upon its head, they might have seen a certain airbender leap away mere moments before it returned to the abyss. But Azula did not see. She only saw that her plans had been thwarted, felt her tenuous grasp on the situation slipping away. But how? She spluttered. You know, that's the exact same look Zuko wore earlier. Naruto's grin grew another inch. Thanks to Aang, now I am free to fight you without anything holding me back. But before I kick your ass, I have one last question. Whatever did happen to old Prince Hothead? I was certain he'd be the one to find me first. You mean my fool of a brother? Azula scoffed, ignoring the flicker of shock that passed through the blonde's visage. I'm not certain. When my spy reported you'd crippled his engines, I'd assumed he'd finally given up once and for all. In any case, your little delay gave me all the time I needed to get here beforehand. And if he does somehow find his way here, I'll simply comply with the Fire Lord's demands and lock him away. Barring that, I'll kill him myself. We've no use for that failure of a prince. At that thought, she frowned. Why are you so concerned for him, anyway? Just idle curiosity, I suppose. Something in the Avatar's tone suggested otherwise, and Azula knew she'd struck a nerve. You really are ruthless, ain't ya? His words were cold. Deadly. Willing to sacrifice anything in the name of duty, even your own brother. Once, that would have disgusted me. It probably still does. But I've got to admit, that's some frightful determination there. If you weren't my enemy, I'd respect you for it. Azula smiled tightly and tucked a stray hair back into place, the picture of perfection once more. Why, thank you. She replied. I must admit, you've done a fairly decent job of mucking up my plans thus far. It's not all that often I have to get my hands dirty. It felt strange to be complimented by her adversary. Many of her enemies were either too arrogant to admit their own flaws, or simply too afraid of facing her wrath to loosen their tongues. That this Avatar had done so, to be respected by her enemy, it made her curious. Just who was this young man? I would very much like to know your name, Avatar. The words escaped her before she could take them back, her initial interest getting the better of her. For the first time since they'd met, the blonde actually looked to be at a loss for words, if only for a moment. Naruto. He supplied at last. Uzumaki Naruto. I'll be sure to remember it. Shall we continue, then? Naruto resumed his stance once, but there was something off about it. His foot was too far forward, and his arms were spread wide. Didn't he see he was full of openings? But if he was hoping to make her hesitate, he had another thing coming. Azula never backed down from any challenge. We shall. Their fists met in small explosions of azure and onyx, colliding over and over again, black and blue fires rippling outward in every direction to scar the landscape, scalding neither. To her dismay, Azula actually found her flames being overwhelmed by those tongues of dark ether, the Avatar's mysterious black flames creeping impossibly forward to obliterate her own. She had an awful feeling something terrible would happen should this inferno find purchase on her skin. Unthinking, the Fire Princess lashed out again, intent upon incinerating him on the spot before those eerie embers could touch her. Nope. Azula frowned as the blonde inhaled, and her flame simply died. Impossible. He'd sucked the oxygen out of her attack. Even as she realized this, the faux Avatar was in motion, flinging a hand forward, his palms closing around her wrist, locking down with enough force to shatter bone. Azula cried out and flung 2 fingers toward, a bolt of jagged lightning leaping from her fingertips. The blonde didn't even bother to release her, he just dipped one hand down, caught the bolt, and redirected it with a single hand, sending her penultimate technique hurtling off into the distance. In that same instant, she opened her mouth and spat. Whoosh! It was with a small pang of regret that she spewed a curtain of flame right at his face and burned his head to ashes. The vice on her wrist slackened, and his body toppled away. Despite all she'd said, she'd hoped to avoid killing him. Such a shame. Now they'd have to search for him all over again. Poof! Naruto's body vanished in a plume of smoke, leaving only dust behind. Azula blinked, her mouth opening in a small round O of shocked surprise. Was this what happened to the Avatar's body when he died? Where was he? Surely the Avatar didn't just poof away like that when he died? What in the name of Agni? Dynamic entry! Came Naruto's ridiculous battle cry, and much like he did Might Guy had done to countless opponents in the past, he landed a perfect kick to Azul's face. She barely had enough time to register the blow before she was sent crashing into a boulder, quickly falling into a pile of crumbled limbs. Scarce had she fallen than he was upon her, fingers wrapping around her throat, slamming her body back into the boulder's spine with enough force to leave an Azula-sized indentation in the stone. "You asked me, am I afraid of fire?" The words were little more than a hiss as he held her there, leering down at her with eyes of angry, rippling violet. "No, little girl, but you should be afraid." "Of me? What are you?" Naruto uttered 2 words then. 2 simple words, and yet they unleashed hell upon the princess. Shinra Tensei. The island of Kyoshi erupted. Mud was the lifeblood of Mother Earth, rippling and roiling around their feet, gushing forth from the massive wound Naruto had carved into her flesh. There could be no describing the force that drove Azula down, deep into the ground's embrace, only that this massive, unseen push did, reducing her armor to ash and snapping a rib like it was glass. What strength! What power! She'd been overwhelmed in an instant, made as helpless as an errant, disobedient child. She could taste the blood in her mouth, barely see the light of day. Was it her hair, torn free from her bun, that shaded her vision so? Or was she dying, her life leeching away despite all her best efforts to grasp that feeble thread? A booted foot struck her stomach, driving her deeper still. Sure enough, the Avatar stood there untouched, his foot planted firmly in her stomach, pinning her to the soil. What are you?" "I am the hope of this world." The blonde replied, violet eyes leering down at her. "I am the answer to all living things that cry out for peace. I am protector of the innocent. I am the light in the darkness. I am truth. Ally to good. Nightmare to you. Now say it. This is your last chance. Say you're sorry. Apologize for what you've done." "I'm sorry." The words tasted like bile in her mouth. She hated every instant of it. Naruto took his foot off before looking at the princess for what felt like a small eternity. Was it her, or were those eyes violet, all of a sudden? "No, you're not. Not yet. But, you will be. Someday." He slammed his heel back down on the girl's stomach, yet again, this time with gusto, causing her to roll over and dry heave. Naruto took that opportunity to grab hold of her head and slammed it into the ground, causing a crack to appear in the earth, a fissure spreading half the width of Kyoshi Island. That was all it took. A single head slam at full strength and the princess of the Fire Nation died. Died. Her last thought was not of home, nor was it of family before the sweet blackness took her. It wasn't even of how she'd been beaten, although her impending death rankled her. It was knowing that there was someone out there, someone incredibly strong, who respected her. Not for her title, or even her bending. But for the single, mindless determination that drove her. The desire to be the best. To stand above everyone. It was the only thing that drove her, beneath the violence and the sadism and the cruelty. She simply wanted to prove that, above all, she was the best. And the only one who respected her for that, had just killed her. How twisted. With that, Azula of the Fire Nation breathed her last. Naruto stared down at the prone princess for a long moment, considering. He should just leave her. Let her stay dead. But, he'd seen the potential for goodness in her, no matter how slim. And for all the cruel things he'd done over the years, he just couldn't let her stay dead. Not with a clear conscience. Then, his mind made up, he opened his eyes, Rinnegan flaring. It was an easy matter to call her soul back to her body, to heal her wounds, repairing the massive internal damage, knitting her spine and ribs back together with careful applications of chakra. Being an avatar of the gods had its privileges, after all. His regenerations might be all but hampered, yet he could now tend and mend injuries that would have made even Sakura and Tsunade balk. Oh, the bitter irony of it all. Finally, when he was certain his revived patient would live to see a second sunrise, he ceased his ministrations. Slinging over his shoulder, he activated the Hiratian seal he'd planted on Katatra and popped back into existence in Kyoshi village. It was a little disorienting using his father's jutsu again after all these years, but it saved him precious time and stamina. It also landed him right in the middle of a battle battle a fierce fight between Aang, Katara, Sokka, the Kyoshi warriors, and the remaining firebenders. Chaos wouldn't even begin to describe what was happening here. Apparently at some point during his one-sided battle with Azula, Zuko had finally made landfall. It was his forces, hardly those of the princess, who were laying waste to the village now, rather difficult when one considered everything was still soaked by the Yanagi's water. Naruto. When did you get dash? He dimly registered Katara's voice in the back of his mind as he ducked under a fireball. Using the Rinne Tensei no Jutsu had left him far more drained than he would have liked, but he still had more than enough juice to spatter a few Fire Nation soldiers. But he had neither the time nor the patience to deal with them. Enough! His voice cracked like thunder, commanding silence and flooring everyone present, ally and enemy included. You idiots are going to drop your weapons now or be disemboweled where you stand. I have had enough of this shit for one day. With the chaos of battle momentarily abated, both sides were able to get a good look at one another. Including that of a certain prince. Zuko started sputtering the moment he laid eyes on him. Why you? Me. Naruto stepped forward, grabbed the scarred youth by the scruff of the neck, and headbutted the poor prince with enough force to knock him a state similar to that of his sister. Sweet dreams, hothead. With his enemy finally silenced, the blonde grunted and glared at the assembled firebenders. Which one of you meatbags is in charge of the princess here? He growled, holding up Azula. Tentatively, a bearded gentleman raised his hand. Naruto summarily chucked Azula's unconscious body at the man. The poor fellow barely managed to catch his princess before she hit the ground. Then without pause or preamble, he turned to address the other firebenders. IROH. He bellowed. Get your ass out here. Now. There was a silence as the men glanced at one another. Finally, they parted, revealing a rather portly-looking man in Fire Nation garb and armor. Despite this own ire, Naruto nearly guffawed. The years had indeed been kind to the general. He was a great deal heavier than Naruto remembered, not to mention older, but still very much in good health. Yes, time had been exceptionally kind indeed. You don't have to shout, Naruto. He sighed, brushing at his sleeve. Who the heck is that? Sokka wondered. Aang shrugged. Beats me. Katara had more practical matters on her mind, such as the situation unfolding before her very eyes. Naruto was giving orders to firebenders? And they were obeying him? But, how? Why? She wasn't entirely certain how she felt about that. Naruto had struck her as many things during his time in the South Pole, a friend, guardian, perhaps even something more than both of those. But never, in her wildest dreams, had she imagined him to have ties with the Fire Nation. Not a once. I see you've taken good care of my niece and nephew. The old general mused, taking in Zuko and Azula's sorry state. Don't get your beard in a bunch. The godly avatar shook his head. I just roughed them up a bit. They're only alive because of our friendship. Which reminds me, you'd better get going. He turned his head to indicate the opposite fleet of ships, still in disarray with defeat of their commander. But it wouldn't last, and they both knew it. Your precious little niece here, intended to capture the two of you, or worse, I'd suggest you beat it skedaddle before you have half the nation on your backs. Oh, and you might want to check your crew for a spy as well. My, that is interesting. Iroh stroked at his beard. I had no idea my brother had planted someone on board our ship, let alone sent Azula after us. Nah, she took the initiative on her own. Naruto replied. Gave me a bit of a fight, too. If you hadn't shown me that technique of yours, she might have done more than singe a few hairs. Ha! The dragon of the west laughed at that, deep and loud from his belly. It was not the laugh of a cruel Fire Nation general, Katara mused. This man actually seemed kind? We'll have to discuss your exploits over tea sometime. Iroh was saying, accepting Zuko from Naruto as she came back to herself. Provided my nephew isn't trying to kill you, of course, Avatar. Naruto barely kept a lid on his emotions in that instant. Somehow, someway, his old friend knew what they were up to. And yet instead of revealing the truth, bringing the lies crashing down around their ears as he could have done, he merely winked. Naruto forced a laugh of his own, silently thanking the gods his old friend was on their side. Ha! So you wanna kick my ass and pie show again? He snapped back, but the words were lacking in rancor. No fair. You know I suck at that game. Muttering to himself, he turned to face Azula's men. Now, listen, and listen good. I'm only going to say this once. You and all of your men are going to take Princess Hothead here, get back on your ships, set sail, or I'm going to make each of you run 15,000 laps around the island. On your hands! His eyes blazed warningly, promising pain to any and all who dared challenge his command. Never in all her life did Katara think to see the men and women of the Fire Nation army, the strongest and mightiest military that this side of the planet has ever seen, cry like babies when they heard what came out of Naruto's mouth. Why yes sir. The blonde declared, am going to bed. I'm getting too goddamned old for this shit. I never paused to consider the consequences of that fight. The ramifications. There simply wasn't any time to dwell upon it. Kyoshi was saved, but our time there was done. Although we defeated the Fire Nation and forced them away from the island, I knew that our very presence would attract unwanted attention. And so, we departed, first thing the next morning. I barely even had time to say goodbye to Suki. Strong girl, that one. I could tell that she wanted to come with us, but she knew her duty lay with her people, to help them rebuild and garrison themselves against the threat. So, we departed, leaving her behind. Or so I thought. Turns out Kyoshi warriors rival shinobi in terms of stealth. By the time we realized she'd stowed away under one of the tarps, we were already halfway to the nearest settlement. That certainly made things amusing when the others discovered her. Our travels were little more than a blur after that. Even the Earth City of Omashu. Now that was an interesting experience. I've never met someone craftier than this boomy fellow. His strategies put Shikamaru to shame in every sense of the word. The old king saw right through our little ruse. He knew Aang was the avatar of the elements, while I was not. In a way, I was almost grateful for it. Someone other than the four of us now knew the truth. But damn was he crazy. To think that someone so old could be so off their rocker. But it wasn't until we happened upon an occupied Earth Kingdom village that things became interesting again. Were it not for a young earthbender named Haru, I wouldn't have had the chance to indulgence in what I'd still consider the ultimate prank of all time. My temper wouldn't have proved beneficial to our cause. Fire is difficult to control, eh? His words were little more than a hiss, fingers tightening inexorably around the man's throat. Funny you should mention that. You know what is even harder to control? My temper. And right now, you're making me very angry, old man. Sapphire eyes flashed dangerously, promising pain. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry. The fool had made the massive mistake of extorting a harmless woman and her son, Haru, for more tax money in his presence, subtly threatening to accidentally lose control of his bending and down their store, much to everyone's dismay. Needless to say, Naruto hadn't taken very kindly to that. You, how dare you do this to me? The firebender grunted. Do you know who I am? No, and I don't much care. Naruto replied, drawing back his fist, a subtle swirl of flame circling in his own fist. Now, would you kindly get the hell out? Snarling, he flung the firebender backwards and out of the shop and spat, enveloping him in flame. It didn't so much kill as it did burn, sending him and his guards shrieking away as they struggled to put out the blaze Naruto had started on their behinds. And don't come back! There was a moment of quiet as their shrieks died away into the distance, then everyone burst out into laughter and guffaws. Priceless! Suki burst out between giggles. That was amazing! Haru grinned. I had no idea you were a bender. Man, that was priceless. Sokka agreed with a cackle. I guess you could say they really got burned on that deal, huh? Ha! Get it? They're firebenders, and they got burned. Silence. What, does no one get the joke? He complained, sullen. I thought it was pretty good. Stick to sarcasm, Sokka. Katara chided with a smile. Still, that was better than what I had planned, Naruto. As always, the blonde never ceased to amaze, or barring that, outright astound. Now that the little snafu with the Fire Nation was temporarily behind them, she was reminded once more why she'd come to admire the blonde. In that, he and Aang were alike. Naruto was never the sort to stand for corruption or injustice. He didn't care what the consequences were. He simply acted. Suki was of a similar mind. She would have been the one to attack if Naruto hadn't done something. Thank you. Haru's mother spoke up suddenly, garnering everyone's attention with her words. It has been so long since someone stood up for us. No one? Suki seemed to speak for everyone when she said this. Surely someone's tried to do something. Anything? A sinister pall fell over the group, as one they began to realize just how much these people were chafing beneath the Fire Nation occupation. No, the woman shook her head, confirming their worst fears. Not since Haru's father and the other earthbenders were taken to the prison. Naruto's ears twitched, the beginnings of a smile started to form on that whiskered visage. Did you say prison? Why yes, he and the other earthbenders were taken there about 5 years ago. Impossibly, Naruto's grin grew. Sokka was the first to recognize it. Oh no. Oh. Aang blanched. Katara seconded the sentiment. I know that look. What? Suki looked from Katara to Aang, even to Sokka. What's wrong? Why is he smiling? I'm afraid I don't understand what's going on. Naruto chose to ignore those words. Guys, I know what we're going to do today. The rest of Team Avatar gulped. Even Suki had a bad feeling about this. She had no idea what was coming next. Jailbreak. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfiction. Looking forward to having you on board again.